Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Gates of Huldah. Today's session is definitely a keeper. The ministry team and I had the opportunity to go to Igbo Landing recently. The history of Igbo Landing is one of rebellion to being enslaved. In 1803, at Dunbar Creek on St. Simon's Island in Georgia, there was a mass suicide of captive Igbo people who had taken control of their slave ship, and they refused to submit to slavery in America. Now, hopefully you have heard the series that I did previously called Negro Find Out Who You Really Are, because I talk about the connection between the Igbo people and so-called African Americans. If you haven't listened to that video, you should see a link in the top right corner. I encourage you to go back and listen to that series. But I want to give you the backstory of this event at Igbo Landing, because many of us only know that enslaved Igbos were brought to St. Simon's and some of them rebelled by committing suicide. But to put things in context, the Slave Trade Act of 1794 was a law passed by the United States Congress that limited American involvement in the international slave trade. So, in May of 1803, the crew of the ship called the Wanderer, they were actually smuggling in these Igbos. The passenger records show that 409 of them survived the Middle Passage. Once they got here, a group of them decided that they were not going to remain here as slaves. Of the ones who survived, the slavers smuggled them ashore in small boats and scattered them on nearby plantations. And they sold them at various slave markets across the South, where they were sold for upwards of $700 a person. I'll do a follow-up video later and share some of the history of St. Simon, particularly the rich heritage of the connection between the Native Americans and the so-called African Americans that lived on the island before and after colonization. So today you're going to hear the oral history as told by one of the direct descendants from the ship, the Wanderer. Her name is Miss Amy Lotson Roberts. Our tour was led by Helen of the St. Simon's African American Heritage Coalition. She's retelling the oral history. Although for more than 2 centuries historians tried to cover this up and to say that this was just an African American folktale, research since 1980 has verified the factual basis of the story and its historical content. The site is now included as a historic resource based on the 2009 county survey. So the team and I, we were blessed to stand inches away from the landing site. I want this session to be a tribute to those who lost their lives. Let's take time to remember the Igbo Landing testament to freedom. Okay, let's get started. And I want to begin by reading an article from the Brunswick News, and it was published in July of 2017. And the title is Let's Take Time to Remember Igbo Landing Testament to Freedom. It says a contingent of distinguished chieftains from West Africa gathered Saturday on the banks of St. Simon's Island's Dunbar Creek to assure their 18th century ancestors who died there are not forgotten. It was a gesture we here in the Golden Isles should do more to emulate. Indeed, the legend of Igbo Landing has long held a fascinating grip on those who treasure our rich local history. but there is nothing in the way of a historical marker or even a plaque to recognize this tragic and inspiring stand for freedom that occurred 214 years ago. Saturday's ceremony was steeped in ritual that dates back to Genesis, as the Igbo claim a lineage to the tribes of Israel through Gad, the seventh son of Jacob. So the writer is making a point to let us know that these were Hebrews, that these were the descendants of the ancient Israelites. Now, this is a picture of Miss Amy Lotson Roberts. She still lives on St. Simon's, and she's written a book. It's called Gullah Geechee Heritage in the Golden Isles. I encourage you to pick up a copy if you can. It's on Amazon. It's a very interesting read. I've started reading and found out a lot of historical facts that I did not know before. But now I want you to listen to Helen as she retells the story from Miss Amy Lotson Roberts.
Okay, so Miss Amy was born and raised here on St. Simon's Island. She's what we call a been here. I would be considered a come here because I come here from Brunswick. But Miss Amy knows the stories. She is a direct descendant from the Wanderers ship that docked in St. Andrews Sound on Jekyll Island. And that was the last slave ship. It was an illegal slave ship that came to the coast of Georgia. Miss Amy is what we call a memory keeper. There were three here on our coast that told the stories of what was before. So it was Miss Karen Ward, who was Mr. Jim Brown's daughter. Mr. Jim Brown was born and raised here on St. Simon's Island. There was also Mr. Jim Bacote. Mr. Jim Bacote was the gentleman that integrated the hotels back in the late 60s, early 70s. He started and founded Geechee Kundal, which is a cultural center in Riceboro, Georgia, and Miss Amy. Miss Amy is the last one that remains alive. So she is very special, not only to the island, but to the preserving of the history here on the Georgia coast. Miss Amy is allowed to come because of everything that I just told you about her. And we are here, I am here because Miss Amy is training me to also give tours as well. And so we are the only tour company. There are other trolleys. We are the only African American tour company here. So there are other trolleys, and like when we were coming to First African Baptist Church, they stayed for a little while and left. Well, they just skim over the African American presence here. And so Mr. Huntley, who owns this part of the property, because it goes across the bridge as well. We'll cross that bridge. But it stretches, and so this part of the property belongs to Mr. Huntley. And what he does is allow us to come to his part of the property to come and see Igbo Landing. It is here that the Igbo men and women, the tribal men and women, they came here and they had their ceremony here. So this has been blessed as holy ground. Never saw this. Roman. It's different. Now I wonder what it is. I bet Miss Amy could tell me, but this is my first year seeing this grove here. It's probably always has, but last year I didn't see it.
So how deep is this water?
This water is very, very tricky. Sometimes the tide is high, like it is now, and sometimes it's really, really low. But it is deep enough to drown.
A boat, so you seen a couple of
Not,
fish.
um, not much anymore because it's private. Um, not much. You see?
Can you give a brief history of what actually happened during the landing of the Igbos?
Okay, so like I said, there were boats that came all from everywhere. And what happened was this particular boat that came, it was full about 75 to 80 Igbos. And they found out in the middle of the Atlantic that they had been tricked to be slaves. So while they were there on their way, they had on their African garbs and everything, but in the middle of the Atlantic, they were stripped of their garbs, and they were placed in chains. And they discovered that they were going to be chattel servants. And so when the boat docked, the slaves, because if you look at the landscape here, it's much like it is in West Africa. You can smell the sea breeze, all of that. And so they thought that this was some type of cruel trick. How can you bring me here and this reminds me of home, but it's not my home? And so 8 to 15 of them that were chained together, they walked into this water as a grand rebellion to say, the water brought me here, the water's going to take me back. Before I become a slave, I'll be dead and buried in my grave. And they walked into this water. This is what they did. It was a rebellion. And like, I said earlier, a lot of people will say that they walked back to Africa. A lot of people say you can still hear the bones rattling, the chains rattling. You can hear people say that they flew back to Africa. Some say that there were other Igbos in the water waiting for them to come and go to a safe place. But the main part is that this was a rebellion. I am not doing this. You are not going to trick me into this. I'm not doing this. And this is why this is so sacred to us. Yes, we would like to have markers. Yes, we would like to commemorate. But since it is the way it is, we are very grateful to Mr. Huntley for allowing us to come on just this part. Because this is a long stretch of land. This is a long stretch of land.
Why was it different for this group of people? Like you said, they had on their African garb and everything about until midway through the trip. Whereas usually we hear the story that they're stripped and they're shaved and they're all this stuff, before they leave. So why was it different?
The Igbo people, you had better do what you say you're gonna do. Don't tell them that you're gonna do something and you do the opposite. So it was no tricking the Igbos. Like, they had to know that this was the deal. And so many of us, like, the new movie, the Harriet Tubman movie is coming out, and I'm truly excited about that. But there were 5,500 slaves that ran away every year. They knew the North Star. They knew where they were going. They knew that the moss grew on certain parts of trees. So we do honor Miss Harriet Tubman. She was wonderful, but there were also Africans that already knew this is not my home. This is not where I want to stay. This is not what I'm going to do. And what I really want us to think about is how we were just so disconnected once we got into the mid-Atlantic. You could not even have a drum to let them know that was going to be a way of communicating and letting them know this is trouble, this is danger. And so a lot of people, a lot of them did not know how horrible this was going to be. They did not know. And so once they found out, a lot of people say that they saw what was going to happen. They saw the other slaves working hard and what they were doing. And they said, no, not us, we're not going to do it.
Lifted up, Lord. The seas have lifted up their voice. The seas have lifted up their pounding waves. Psalm 93 and 3. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord, my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death, and my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. Psalms 13, 1 through 5. Vengeance is mine, I will repay. In due time, their foot will slip, for their day of disaster is near, and their doom is coming quickly. Deuteronomy 32:35. May we never forget.